Kia ora koutou whānau, welcome to episode 6 of Paul and Henry talking about stuff that you should know. I've got my laptop open today, and the reason I've done that is Hazel and Jenna have been working on building investigation skills modules and putting them into e-modules, taking all of my garbage and paper and making it look really sharp and really succinct and really meaningful. I'm quite excited about that. I'm not sure when they're coming out in their final version, but I'm putting the wee plug in now. And the reason why I've got it open is that today we're talking about planning, and we've got a whole module on planning, and I'm looking at the e-module, so I'm going to talk you through some of that. I think, 1 second, I'm just going to turn this annoying noise off. Joys of technology. I love this saying, I think it was Abraham Lincoln, he said, give me 5 hours to cut down a tree, and I'll spend the first 4 hours sharpening my axe. And yeah. I think of that quite often. I think if you got a bunch of time to do something, you can't commit too much time up front into the planning. And from an investigation point of view, it's probably the one thing that investigators universally get wrong all the time, or they don't commit enough time into doing that planning. The tendency is to rush into stuff. It's exciting. You get a new file, there's evidence to be found or people to talk to, and it's pretty easy to rush into that stuff. So I've kind of come up with this sort of 4-phase model for planning or for running, and I'll talk about it in an investigative context, but you can relate this to any of the work that you do. And the first one of those is the establishment phase. So actually, when you're doing your planning, think about, we're going to have a phase up front where we kind of do some establishing ourselves in the inquiry and what it is that we're doing. That might be really, really small. It might be just a routine thing. Or if you're venturing into new ground, you might want to spend quite a bit of time doing it. Some of the stuff you should be thinking about when you're doing that establishment phase is the legislative powers that you have. Yes. And I think that should be the first thing you should think about is, have I got the statutory basis to do this? Have I got the powers? And if not, do I need to have them? Or do I need to go and get some or get someone who's got them? So do you want to talk about that, Henry?
Yeah, so we should all be clear about what statutory powers we can exercise. So statutory powers under legislation, things that we can only do because we have special legal authority. So the first place to look is the statutory delegations spreadsheet, and we'll put a link below of the on-ramp page with all the information about our delegations and where to check those. And the other thing that a lot of people have is they also have warrants. So just to explain the difference, the delegated powers are powers that the legislation gives to the director or to Waka Kotahi, the agency. And then they get delegated down to a position holder, like a senior rail safety officer or a job title. There are the really good powers, basically, the really strong ones, are given to individuals like Paul Fenton and Henry Clayton with a warrant. The warrants used to be from our chief executive, now they'll be from Kane as Director of Land Transport. And if you have warranted powers, you should know that stuff really well. You should have a copy of your warrant, take it with you. A lot of times you also need an ID card to take both with you, the warrant and the ID card. And oftentimes our ID cards will say that you can see a copy of your delegations on request. And so you need to know where to find them, and that's in the big statutory delegation spreadsheet. So you need to know what powers you have. And if you've got powers that are relevant to what you're doing, but you don't hold them, they're one up with your manager or they've somehow missed your team, you will figure that out in the planning stage and we can sort that out for you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You don't want to find that out later on, when you've done all this great work and gone, actually, I didn't have the lawful authority to be doing that work.
Yeah.
So it's now a contentious issue and possibly going to get thrown out.
Yeah.
So the first thing there, when you sit into your establishment phase, what's the legal basis for what I'm doing? And know your powers, but also know the limitation and any requirements. Like you talked about, I've got to show my ID, or have I got my ID? Yeah, it's okay. Make sure I take that with me. All of those sorts of things. I've chunked this establishment phase into 3 things. So the first one is logistics. This one is often missed. You need to be thinking about, what are the logistics of what I'm doing? What size is this going to be? How am I going to store my evidence? Who am I going to need to come along with me? What's the special equipment that I might need? what am I going to communicate to other staff and when, and how do I do that? All that kind of logistical stuff. And what support services might I need?
Yep.
Am I going to need an interpreter? Am I going to need a forensic specialist in something? Think about all of those things in logistics. And then you need to be thinking about roles and responsibilities. And this is about having the right people doing the right things at the right time. A bit like right tools, right time, right impact, but it's right people doing the right things. I've worked in inquiries before where very experienced investigators have ended up being the logistics officers running around organising office furniture, to start up a big investigation. Absolute waste of their time and not their skill. It doesn't go well for anyone, and they get frustrated, and your office furniture is not going to be what you need. So you need to be thinking about who's doing what, particularly if it's a job where you might need some help. So you're really crystal clear about decision making, about the areas of responsibility, all of those types of things. And the next thing you want to be thinking about quite strongly in the planning phase, and this is another thing that can sometimes get missed, is communication. So being really, really clear, who do I need to be communicating with about what I'm doing? The last thing I imagine that the executive, or Kane as the director, or Nicole as the chief executive, want to do is to turn up to work on Monday and find that Waka Kotahi is in the newspaper doing an investigation into something, and they don't know about it. They don't want to get a question from the minister to go, what are you doing here? And that's the first they've heard. So I'm not saying you need to tell Kane and Nicole every time you're going to do something, but just turn your mind to, who do I need to talk to? And are there some people that I need to talk to that can remove some sort of roadblocks for me? So if I'm going to have to urgently travel somewhere or urgently do something, and going through the ordinary sort of organisational process might delay that, who do I need to talk to get that out of the way so I can just get on and do the urgent stuff that needs to be done?
Yeah. Just on sort of briefing up, with a lot of our regulatory work now falls within the director's statutorily independent functions. So where Kane is director and all of us as his delegates can't be directed by the board or the minister or the chief executive, but we can still give a no surprises briefing.
Yep.
So we can still let people know, hey, doing this, it might get into the media. And by the way, it's something that actually you can't tell us what to do about, but we wanted to give you no surprises briefing anyway. So we can still do that. The other thing in planning for me is timeframes, legal timeframes. So the other thing to check in the law is, do we have those 20 working day deadlines or 10 working day deadlines? Are our powers only to take a copy? So you need to have a plan of how you're going to copy that stuff and give the originals back. It can be you don't want to find out about a legal deadline after it's passed, or just before, normally
the day before,
and then there's a big panic. So watch out for that.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, really map out all of your timeframes and map out the things that are going to restrict or hinder you. Almost understand the rules and the field that you're playing on. And I'll just make a quick point now. All of that stuff might sound like, crikey, I've got to do all that work and it's a bit of stuff to do. But if you get that stuff right, you won't have a whole range of problems down the end, like, oh, whoopsie, I've only got a day to go, or whoopsie, I didn't have the right delegation, or I sent the wrong person to do that job and I should have sent someone different because of their skill set. The next phase we get into is kind of what I call collecting the evidence and planning your inquiries. And this is the bit that most investigators do really well. And they sit down and draw up a big list of all the potential inquiries that they need to make. I'm not going to teach everyone how to do that. It's pretty straightforward. You just need to think outside the box. And I've just made a couple of bullet points here in the module, and I'll actually read them to you because I think these are worth reflecting on. What inquiries must I make before I interview that person? So if you've got on your list, go and interview Henry, what's the timing of that? Do I need to go and make some other inquiries first so I'm in a better position? And what might I lose if I wait? So should I interview Henry right now while stuff's hot and fresh, or should I actually just let him cool for a minute and go and get some more information myself, or should I do both? What might I gain if I make this inquiry now? So if I make this inquiry now, what am I going to get compared to if I wait a little bit? Am I going to get more or something different, or am I going to lose something if I wait? Will these inquiries tip someone off that I don't want to have tipped off? So if I'm going to turn up to Henry's office and require him to provide me a whole bunch of documents, and I'm worried that, hey, he's the kind of guy that's going to shred these if he knows I'm coming, I want to be careful that I don't start making inquiries that let him know that's going to happen. So just think about those things. And do I need to get this analysed now, or can it wait? So if I've taken an exhibit, I might need to have that forensically examined before I go and interview someone about it, or can I actually just wait until I've done it, until I've interviewed them, and in fact the interview might help me decide whether or not it needs to be forensically examined. I don't know the answer to any of those things. They're all things that are really contextually specific to each case that you work on.
Yeah.
But you need to spend those 4 hours sharpening your axe and sitting down and thinking very, very strategically around how you're doing your inquiries and the timing of those.
Yeah. That just made me think of a more detailed point. Every industry is very gossipy, but it seems to me that the trucking industry is particularly gossipy. So you might be out dealing with a particular operator and they might say, why are you investigating me? Why aren't you investigating that outfit down the road? Or I heard you're investigating that outfit down the road. I suppose you're going to pop in and see Bob next week and do the same. I think our official line is we don't comment on other possible investigations.
No.
You might actually know something about that from a colleague and think it's helpful to say, oh, yeah, actually a colleague of mine will be seeing Bob next week, but you don't know what your colleague knows. So just say nothing. And we don't comment on other investigations for lots of other fairness reasons. So you should feel confident running.
There's a really good point here you're making, and that is when you're thinking about your lawful requirements and your obligations up front around your powers, think about those other things too, like Privacy Act, OIA. How are we going to deal with those things that tell us how we have to do our particular work?
Yeah.
And if I take this in this way, that's going to be subject to the OIA or not. And it's not to say that you should be trying to find cunning ways to skirt the law. The law's there, we should be complying with it, but you just need to be aware of what's happening. And that sometimes comes up, and we'll probably do another whole session on this about receiving information where people say, I want to give you this in confidence.
Yes. We've had a question through.
We'll do another module on that, but I think if you get that stuff, you need to do some planning around it.
Yes.
Really strong planning, but that's for a different subject. One thing I forgot to mention before, quite embarrassingly, the number one thing you should be thinking about too when you're doing your establishment phase is your health and safety. I kind of just took that as a given, but you really should turn your mind to it. And in some cases, really document what you're doing. If it requires a risk assessment, absolutely turn your mind to doing one of those. If you're going to be out in the field doing something different, then do a risk assessment. Think about what's the PPE I need to wear. There's a whole bunch of health and safety considerations in there. We should probably get Mel along to talk about health and safety one day.
We should. I was just thinking, I don't have anything useful to say about health and safety, but I agree.
Well, yeah, it's pretty important.
Be safe, be healthy.
Yeah. So we've talked about the different things about your establishment phase. You know your powers. You understand what you've got to do. You've got your logistics sorted. You've covered your health and safety. You've gone out and done some inquiry work. Now there's this other big piece of work that I think investigators don't do a very good job of. It's the analysis phase. And actually you need to sit down and do some planning around how you're going to do your analysis. What often happens is people will start collecting the facts and the evidence, and then they do what I call analysis by report writing.
Yeah.
So they sit down to write their report, and they start in their head, they're doing the analysis while they're trying to write their report, and they get I know I do this when I've tried to do it. You kind of get confused with crafting a nice sounding sentence with the facts.
Yeah.
And you tie yourself up in knots, and then you start to go, oh, there's a bit missing here. And if that ever happens, if there's a bit that you're not clear on, it's probably because you need to go back and do some more evidence collection.
Yeah.
You haven't picked something up that you should have done.
Yeah.
So take the time to sit down and go, how am I going to do my analysis on this? What sort of model am I going to use? Am I going to use a big full formal model like the barrier analysis technique? Or am I just going to do a quick and dirty on the whiteboard with a couple of my colleagues? Either way is cool. Make sure you get the right one for what you're doing.
Yeah. Now, if you're not an investigator and you're still with us, thank you. Because what I'm about to say applies to a whole lot of people in reg services, not investigators, which is about that legal decision making decisions within statutory frameworks. So what I wanted to say is we have lots of good templates in the agency. And to me, a good template is one that helps you organise your thoughts. But if you're finding that a template isn't quite working, don't try and put a square peg in a round hole.
Yeah.
It's just sort of scaffolding to help you organise your thinking. But the other thing a good template does is it's a security blanket, because it means you're comprehensive in your documentation. You cover all the things you need to cover. So I wanted to talk about the difference between criteria and factors. So in legislation, some of our decisions is what I call criteria, which is that checklist style. There are elements we have to satisfy each element or tick them off. Now, we used to have this with the old exemptions test in section 166. The first criteria was that the risk to safety will not be significantly increased. So we had to tick that off. Then we had a choice of 4 other criteria, and you had to tick at least one. So you could tick more than one, but you had to pick. Now what we've got is 168D, which is fundamentally different, because this is factors or considerations. And you have to consider all of them. So sometimes we talk about mandatory considerations. You must consider all of them, but you get to decide what the weighting is.
So the cool thing here, Henry, if I could jump in, is if you link this back to the planning, when you're doing your establishment stuff at the start, you should be really clear there's some legal requirements here for us to consider some certain factors.
Yeah.
That helps us shape the types of inquiries that we need to make, or the evidence we need to collect, to say that we've considered those factors and we've let the evidence speak for itself.
Yep.
And we've done them in accordance with this piece of,
Yep.
I forget the section.
Yes. So 168D, it's actually a bit of a hybrid. So it has a criterion to begin, which is that the exemption is no broader than reasonably necessary. So we have to tick that off. Then we have to consider 4 factors: agency's objective, safety, whether it supports an emergency or other event, and anything else. The important thing is with each of those factors, you've got to think about, does it support the exemption or not support the exemption,
or something in the middle? Is it neither here nor there?
So what I like to do there for that one is I create a simple table, 4 rows for each of the 4 criteria, and then 2 other columns, for and against. And that sort of template forces you to think about and write something simple down for each one, even if it's not applicable, because that's how you'll show that you've turned your mind to it, and how you can prove that you have considered all of those factors.
And when you're doing your planning and you start your inquiry phase, and you know that you need to fill in this matrix of your factors, and you've planned your inquiries around what you need to do, your analysis phase can begin early. These things don't have to be run chronologically. You could, in big inquiries, I've done this where I've had people from day one starting to do the analysis. So as the evidence and information's coming in, they're sitting there doing the analysis, and you start to build a theory of a case. And there's some bias stuff there that we could talk about all day that you have to be aware of. But if you know what it is that your requirements are, and you plan your inquiries to those, you can start analysing it. And that might mean that you begin your collection and you go, and good planning should have stop-go points, stop-go, do something different points. You get to a point where you go, how are we tracking? Oh, we haven't met the first criteria, therefore, little point doing everything else. Let's change tack. It might be we wrap this up, or we do something different.
Yeah, that's right. So I've talked about mandatory considerations where we must consider all those things. The other thing we have sometimes is relevant considerations or permissive considerations, things we may consider. So these are not like a checklist in that you don't have to deal with all of them, but they definitely give you a good steer. So for example, the fit and proper person test in the Land Transport Act, Section 30C sets out a whole lot of things that we may consider and give weight to. Now, normally we do look at all of these, but this is a bit more forgiving. So person's criminal history, transport-related offence, history of serious behavioural problems, any complaints made, and so on. Now, hopefully, in a lot of cases, there's nothing to say about any of those because we're dealing with people who have got a good background and are fit and proper. But those are the things that we may have a look at. So just be really clear in your head. Is it criteria that each have to be satisfied? Is it factors you have to consider, or is it factors you may consider?
And when you read that list out, it sounded to me like that was the platform or the basis for the beginning of your inquiries.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have to consider their previous criminal history.
Yeah. And that
straight away,
all,
that says, hey, here's some inquiries I need to make about their previous criminal history.
And that particular example, that stuff's well systematized about how we do all of that. Now, final comment. Unfortunately, that section about fit and proper is called general safety criteria. And I think that's a confusing label. I don't think it's criteria. So before anyone writes in and says, hold on a minute. Yes, I agree with you. There you go. Now we're all experts.
That just says that in your planning, and if you're doing this stuff really well at the start, you're sharpening your axe, you might look at the legislation and go, I need to get some legal advice around this. And that features in that planning around right people doing the right things at the right time.
Yep.
Don't go and do all your inquiries, then get the legal advice to find out whether it's right or not. Go and find out early on so you know when I'm making my inquiries, here's where I need to be positioning them. Because the legal advice tells me that this is what this means. I hope that makes sense. We should probably wrap up.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes, you can.
So the key to any litigation is planning as well. The key to any success in court is good planning. Now, hopefully you're familiar with the proof-making model, or sometimes people call it the evidence table. But a really simple thing to do, even when you're really experienced, is to take an offence or some other legal test and break down the elements of the offence. What are all of the separate things that we'd have to prove if we're in court, or just if somebody challenged us and we have to be scrutinised? Break those elements down into a table. The next column is what are the facts that prove that we've satisfied that element. And then the next column is what is the evidence we have to prove that fact. And if you break that all down into a table and you know you've got to fill in every square, you can see visually really clearly that'll help you with your planning and your decision making. So even the most basic stuff, I still like to break down the elements of the offence. What are the facts? What are the evidence? And as I say, the key to litigation is good planning. Use that proof-making model, and that will be great. And then if we ever do get challenged, it makes it really easy. We've got a really great platform to start from.
So there we go. I'll try and wrap this up off the top of my head. Think about your planning in 4 different phases. You've got your establishment phase where you're going, what do I need to do the job? And that includes all of the legal stuff, the powers, the people, the equipment. I've got my health and safety covered off. You then look at what are the inquiries I need to undertake, and they're informed by the planning that you've done. And all of this too, I must mention, is a bit of a moving feast sometimes because new information will come in and that might change the course of things. So in your plan, you've got to have those points where you're sitting down and really assessing where you are and where you're going. You don't just write your plan and stick to it. And then once you've done that, you need a plan to analyse this. Well, not once you've done it. You need a plan to analyse your information.
And a good framework for your analysis to organise your thoughts and be comprehensive and make sure you're covering off everything you need to.
And then at the end, you need a plan for how we're going to do these outcomes and arrive at the decision-making stuff. All of that sounds like extra work, but actually if you do this stuff really well, it's only going to take you an hour to chop down the tree. It's it's well worth doing. And again, like all of these things we're talking about, it covers you later on. If someone's going, why did you do this, or why didn't you do this, is often the big question. And you can go back to your plan and go, hey, look, we thought about that and we didn't do it for these 3 reasons. And you're safe. That's all from us. Thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing you, talking to you next time when we're going to have someone different come along. I think I'll have to check with the organisers about that.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Special guests coming up.
Ka kite anō.